Summer 1943, at a dusty military siding in the American South. Armed military police stand ready with transport chains, expecting a trainload of hardened Afrika Korps veterans. Instead, as the boxcar doors slide open, the guards face an immediate shock. A small, exhausted group of young German women in Wehrmacht auxiliary and Red Cross uniforms. Indoctrinated by propaganda, these terrified women are convinced they face immediate execution upon American soil. As the confused guards hesitate, the United States military suddenly finds itself holding female enemy combatants on the home front, an unprecedented problem the War Department had never anticipated and had no idea how to solve. The presence of female Axis prisoners on the domestic home front quickly became one of the most puzzling logistical and legal anomalies of the Second World War. The American military bureaucracy was a massive, uncompromising machine, strictly optimized for processing, transporting, and securing millions of male combatants. The sudden arrival of captured women threatened to completely disrupt this standardized transatlantic prisoner pipeline, instantly throwing the War Department into an administrative crisis. How exactly did a relentless war machine adapt the rigid rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention to accommodate women in uniform? And more importantly, what happened when the apocalyptic, propaganda-fueled conditioning of these captives directly collided with the jarring reality of American industrial abundance? To understand how these terrified women ended up behind barbed wire in the American South, we must first trace the blind, rigid administrative machinery that accidentally swept them across the Atlantic. By the spring of 1943, the Allied victory in North Africa had created an overwhelming, immediate crisis of scale. The collapse of the Axis bridgehead in Tunisia left British and American forces holding over 250,000 German and Italian prisoners of war. The rudimentary holding pens in the desert were bursting, and the local infrastructure could not sustain the massive caloric, medical, and security demands of a captive army. To alleviate this paralyzing pressure on the forward staging areas, the Allies engineered a massive transatlantic pipeline. The logistics were ruthlessly efficient. Liberty ships that had unloaded troops and materiel in North Africa and later in Italy were repurposed for their return voyages across the Atlantic. Instead of sailing empty, their holds were packed with thousands of enemy combatants destined for newly constructed high-capacity internment camps sprawling across the American Midwest and South. This pipeline was a blunt instrument, designed exclusively for processing male frontline soldiers. It operated on speed, volume, and standardized paperwork. But the chaotic final days of the North African campaign had ensnared more than just infantry and tank crews. As American and British armored columns rapidly overran Axis rear echelon positions, they bypassed standard front lines and suddenly engulfed divisional headquarters, communication hubs, and sprawling field hospitals. In the confusion of the swift collapse, Allied troops found themselves taking custody of a demographic they were completely unprepared to handle: uniformed German women. These were the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, female signals auxiliaries, telephone operators, and administrative staff, alongside dozens of German Red Cross nurses. Swept up in the collapsing pocket around Tunis and Bizerta, these women were thrust into the hands of frontline combat units who had no standard operating procedure for female captives. The immediate military reflex was to push them rearward into the established pipeline, feeding them into the exact same processing channels as the men. Almost immediately, this triggered a profound administrative and legal dilemma at Allied headquarters. The American military was strictly bound by the rigid tenets of the 1929 Geneva Convention, but the international legal frameworks of the era were thoroughly unprepared for the realities of modern, mechanized total war, specifically the mass mobilization of female personnel. When American legal officers scrutinized the status of the Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, they discovered a baffling loophole deliberately engineered by the Third Reich. According to German military law, these women were not officially classified as soldiers. To preserve the ideological image of the German woman, the Nazi state categorized them as Wehrmachtgefolge, civilian contract employees serving the armed forces, not formal members of the military. This civilian classification meant they technically fell outside the standard protections and protocols designated for prisoners of war. Yet, they had been captured in a combat zone, wearing military-style uniforms, operating military communications equipment, and subject to strict military discipline. American legal officers were thrown into a frantic scramble. They could not legally treat them as civilian internees because of their direct operational roles, but formally recognizing them as enemy combatants violated existing domestic military segregation protocols and lacked clear international precedent. The most obvious solution, repatriating them immediately to German authorities or transferring them to neutral territory, was logistically impossible. The Battle of the Atlantic was still raging. The ocean was a vast, active hunting ground patrolled by German U-boats. Placing female non-combatants onto heavily targeted Allied transport ships, which were not clearly marked and illuminated as hospital vessels, to send them back to Europe would have been a direct violation of safety protocols and a near-certain death sentence. Furthermore, the Allied High Command explicitly forbade commanders from leaving non-essential personnel in North African staging areas, where every pound of food and drop of water was needed for the impending invasion of Sicily. The American military machine was paralyzed by a clash between inflexible international treaties, the messy reality of the battlefield, and the lethal logistics of the Atlantic crossing. With the holding pens overflowing and the transport ships ready to sail, a choice had to be made. There was no time for lengthy diplomatic negotiations. Forced by the sheer momentum of their own logistical pipeline, the War Department made a quiet, unprecedented decision. Ignoring the legal ambiguities and the absolute lack of domestic preparation, these female captives would be processed under the exact same system as the men. They would be loaded onto the convoy ships, classified effectively as standard prisoners of war, and shipped directly into the American interior. After weeks deep in the stifling holds of Atlantic convoy ships, the female captives were transferred to blacked-out trains grinding deep into the American interior. When the heavy steel brakes finally screeched to a halt at isolated, newly designated facilities like Camp Aliceville in the sweltering heat of Alabama, the women braced for the end. For years, the propaganda apparatus of the Third Reich had saturated their minds with terrifying caricatures of the enemy. They had been relentlessly indoctrinated to believe that capture by the Americans meant brutal interrogations, forced labor in penal colonies, or immediate execution against a wall. Stepping out of the rail cars onto the dusty platforms, many of the women were physically paralyzed by the expectation of violence. Instead, the reality of the American military machine hit them with a jarring, disorienting precision. There were no beatings. There were no screaming interrogators. American military police, operating under strict War Department directives, calmly stepped forward and removed all transport restraints. Rather than being marched toward a firing squad, the terrified captives were funneled into pristine, brightly lit administrative processing centers. The American officers treated them with a clinical, almost sterile detachment. The guards were not interested in vengeance. They were focused entirely on logistics and international law. Adhering strictly to the letter of the 1929 Geneva Convention, military administrators handed the women crisp registration forms, basic toiletries, and assigned them to clean, heated wooden barracks. But the ultimate breaking point for their propaganda-conditioned worldview arrived in the camp mess hall. The United States military simply issued them the standard American prisoner of war rations. Their metal trays were loaded with fresh meat, thick slices of white bread, real coffee, and they were given unrestricted access to actual bars of soap. It was a staggering level of material abundance that had long since vanished from the civilian markets of wartime Germany. The sheer caloric weight of their first meal in captivity drastically eclipsed the heavily restricted diets they had just left behind on the home front. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. Their deeply ingrained terror of a barbaric enemy was instantly neutralized by a meticulous, industrialized bureaucracy that fed its prisoners better than the German state fed its own citizens. The immediate fear of death evaporated. But as the chain-link gates locked behind them, securing them in this bizarre sanctuary of plenty, a very different kind of battle was about to begin for control of the prisoners' loyalty. For the American camp commanders on the ground, however, this battle for loyalty was entirely secondary to an immediate, unprecedented administrative nightmare. The War Department had successfully moved these female captives across the Atlantic, but integrating them into a domestic prison network designed exclusively for men required a frantic, costly scramble. Across the country, the military bureaucracy was forced to expend disproportionate resources to construct highly isolated, female-only compounds within the existing camp infrastructure. At facilities like Camp Weingarten in Missouri and Camp Aliceville in Alabama, engineers hastily erected secondary perimeters, erecting internal double fences and installing opaque privacy screens to completely segregate the women from the tens of thousands of male Axis prisoners held in adjacent sectors. The logistical friction was immediate and severe. The men commanding these domestic installations were often combat-trained officers or seasoned military administrators, entirely accustomed to the rigid, standardized protocols of managing captured infantrymen. Suddenly, they found themselves staring at their desks, drafting bewildered, highly classified memos to the War Department in Washington, pleading for procedural guidance on situations the United States Army had never formally codified. Declassified administrative archives reveal a chain of command struggling with the mundane realities of female captivity. Camp commanders demanded to know the exact protocol for requisitioning female uniform replacements through a quartermaster supply chain built entirely for male soldiers. They sent urgent inquiries regarding the legal and medical standards for providing gynecological and obstetrical care to enemy combatants. They requested immediate clarification on what specific types of daily work details were legally permissible for female prisoners under the strict guidelines of the 1929 Geneva Convention. The American military machine, a logistical leviathan capable of moving entire armies across oceans, found its gears grinding to a halt over the procurement of civilian undergarments and the complexities of gender segregation in a wartime prison environment. But while the American bureaucracy struggled to categorize them, the women behind the wire were rapidly organizing themselves. The initial shock of their survival and the disorientation of American material abundance quickly calcified into a fierce, structured defiance. They were not docile captives passively waiting out the war. Almost immediately, a rigid shadow hierarchy materialized within the female compounds, spearheaded by veteran Red Cross matrons and senior signals auxiliaries. These older, deeply indoctrinated women understood that without strict internal discipline, the morale of the younger captives would entirely collapse under the psychological weight of isolation. They aggressively re-established the military protocols of the Third Reich right under the noses of their American guards. They mandated immaculate barracks inspections, organized rigorous physical training routines in the dusty compounds, and enforced daily morning formations where the women would stand at attention and sing nationalistic German anthems. This highly visible defiance was not merely a display of loyalty to a distant homeland. It was a desperate psychological defense mechanism. The shadow leadership explicitly ordered the younger women to refuse any display of weakness, homesickness, or, above all, gratitude toward their American captors. The fresh meat, the white bread, and the warm barracks were deliberately reframed by the senior auxiliaries not as basic humane treatment, but as a calculated, insidious form of psychological warfare designed to soften their resolve and betray their nation. Peer pressure became a brutal weapon of internal camp control. Any woman caught fraternizing with the guards, expressing relief at being out of the war, or showing appreciation for the American rations, was swiftly ostracized, subjected to silent treatment, or formally disciplined by the Shadow Command. They transformed their compounds into miniature, defiant islands of the German Reich, determined to prove that barbed wire could not break their ideological armor. The American military, however, was not oblivious to this internal resistance. Rather than attempting to break the Shadow Command with physical punishment or harsh deprivations, which would explicitly violate the Geneva Convention, the Provost Marshal General's office initiated a quiet, systematic intelligence-gathering operation. The Americans simply watched, listened, and read. Through comprehensive postal censorship and covert camp monitoring, military intelligence intercepted thousands of outgoing letters destined for Germany and heavily monitored internal communications within the compounds. The resulting intelligence summaries, circulated among high-ranking War Department officials, revealed a striking contradiction. The postal census discovered that the outward displays of rigid ideological defiance, the crisp salutes and the defiant morning songs, were largely a fragile, mandated facade. Behind the closed doors of the barracks, the intelligence reports painted a portrait of profound psychological distress. The intercepted letters exposed deep, paralyzing homesickness, extreme anxiety regarding the fate of their families under Allied bombing, and a deep existential confusion about their role in a collapsing empire. Nazi ideology had relentlessly praised women as the cultural mothers of the nation, the sacred keepers of the domestic hearth. Yet here they were, wearing military uniforms, locked in foreign cages, thousands of miles from home, classified by their captors as enemy combatants. This agonizing contradiction tore at their identities. The intelligence officers noted that the younger women, in particular, were terrified of the future, masking their profound vulnerability behind the strict, peer-enforced bravado of their senior commanders. The rigid discipline of the camp hierarchy was not a sign of unbreakable strength, but a desperate collective mechanism to prevent a total psychological breakdown. Yet the most devastating blow to their ideological resolve did not come from American interrogators or the realization of their own internal contradictions. The dam finally broke through the sheer, undeniable weight of American material reality. As the months passed, the female prisoners were integrated into the camp labor system, earning standard military scrip, often about 80 cents a day, for performing allowable tasks such as laundry, tailoring, and clerical work. This camp currency granted them access to the post exchange, the camp canteen. Here, the ideological conditioning of the Third Reich violently collided with the staggering output of American capitalism. The women were permitted to browse and order from thick, comprehensive American mail-order catalogs, most notably from Sears, Roebuck and Company. For women who had spent years navigating a heavily rationed, war-torn German economy where basic necessities were scarce and luxury goods were entirely non-existent, these catalogs were weapons of mass demoralization. They flipped through hundreds of glossy pages displaying affordable dresses, leather shoes, modern kitchen appliances, cosmetics, and children's toys, an uninterrupted avalanche of consumer goods readily available to the average American citizen in the middle of a total global conflict. This localized exposure to consumer abundance was compounded by what they could physically see beyond the barbed wire. The camps in the Midwest and South were often situated near major transportation arteries. Through the chain-link fences, the female auxiliaries, many of whom had been highly trained in logistical tracking, signals intelligence, and resource management for the Wehrmacht, stood and watched the American home front operate. They observed endless, mile-long freight trains hauling heavy machinery, grain, and munitions without interruption. They saw unrationed civilian automobiles crowding the highways. They noticed that at night, the American towns blazed with electric light, completely devoid of the blackout curtains and air raid sirens that defined nocturnal life in Europe. The skies above them were filled with newly manufactured aircraft flying training routes, completely unchallenged by any enemy threat. The women quietly did the math. The uninterrupted, colossal volume of industrial logistics flowing past their fences provided mathematical proof that the American home front was entirely untouched and operating at a scale the Axis powers could not possibly comprehend. Quietly, in the dark of the barracks, Away from the watchful eyes of their senior matrons, the realization set in. The propaganda they had been fed about a weak, divided, and technologically inferior America was a catastrophic lie. The sheer tonnage of Allied industrial supremacy made an Axis victory mathematically impossible. Their ideological armor did not shatter violently. It simply dissolved into cold, pragmatic despair. As this quiet psychological surrender took hold inside the wire, a completely different conflict was erupting outside of it. By 1944, the War Department's attempt to quietly manage the female prisoners was failing, as the American public began to take notice of the sprawling camps in their own backyards. A profound institutional friction developed, pitting the military's strict adherence to international law against boiling domestic political pressure. The War Department was trapped in a delicate diplomatic hostage situation. The Provost Marshal General insisted on adhering to the absolute letter of the 1929 Geneva Convention, providing excellent food, warm housing, and recreational facilities, because this was the only leverage the United States had to ensure the reciprocal, humane treatment of captured American GIs held in German camps across Europe. But the American public, entirely unaware of this high-stakes diplomatic calculus, only saw the immediate optics. Local newspapers began publishing sensationalized reports detailing the comfortable conditions inside the prisoner compounds. Rumors spread of pampered Nazi captives eating prime cuts of beef, buying imported chocolates, and purchasing cosmetics at a time when American civilians were subjected to strict federal rationing of gasoline, meat, sugar, and nylon. Labor unions staged protests, furiously objecting to the use of enemy prisoner labor in local agriculture and industry, arguing it depressed domestic wages, despite the severe wartime labor shortage. The political outrage reached the halls of Congress. Citizens whose sons were fighting, bleeding, and dying in the frozen mud of Italy or the dense jungles of the Pacific wrote furious letters demanding to know why female enemy combatants were living in relative luxury on the taxpayer's dime. The War Department was forced to deploy public relations officers to local communities, desperately trying to explain the strategic necessity of the Geneva Convention to a grieving, ration-weary populace. By the late autumn of 1944, a highly fragile equilibrium had been established. The War Department had managed to weather the public relations storm while keeping the camps running efficiently. Behind the double fences, the female prisoners had largely abandoned their active resistance, adapting to the quiet, comfortable routine of their captivity. They were physically safe, geographically isolated from the horrors of the battlefield, and well fed. But this sanctuary of routine was an illusion, entirely dependent on isolation. The war across the ocean was reaching its brutal climax, and the strict Allied postal blockade that had shielded them from the truth was beginning to leak. News from a collapsing Europe was about to cross the Atlantic, and it was about to turn their well-fed sanctuary into a place of absolute psychological torment. In the early months of 1945, the strict informational quarantine surrounding the American camps finally began to fracture. As the International Red Cross expanded its oversight and delayed prisoner mail slowly filtered through military censors, the isolated female captives were suddenly slammed by the unfiltered reality of a collapsing Reich. The letters they received were no longer heavily redacted propaganda updates. They were fragmented, desperate dispatches from a nation undergoing systematic annihilation. Sitting in brightly lit mess halls, surrounded by the surreal abundance of the American home front, the women read the harrowing details of their homeland's physical erasure. They learned of the relentless Allied firebombing campaigns that were turning historic residential cities and industrial hubs into sprawling landscapes of ash. Even more terrifying were the frantic accounts arriving from the east. The Soviet Red Army had breached the German borders. The delayed letters detailed the violent, rapid collapse of the eastern provinces, painting a grim picture of millions of displaced civilians fleeing the Soviet advance, with countless family members suddenly swallowed by the chaos, listed simply as missing or dead. The psychological torment was absolute. These women were trapped in an agonizing paradox of survival. They were physically healthier than they had been in years, eating regular meals and sleeping in warm, secure barracks, while being forced to helplessly witness the total destruction of everything they had left behind. Their comfortable sanctuary had become an inescapable psychological prison. When the Third Reich officially surrendered in May 1945, there was no relief behind the barbed wire. The capitulation of the German state did not bring freedom. Instead, the captives immediately realized that the end of the war triggered a terrifying new administrative countdown. Stripped of their nation, their families, and their military status, the women faced an impending logistical reality that they suddenly dreaded far more than their initial capture. The American military bureaucracy, which had so efficiently brought them across the Atlantic, now shifted its gears in reverse. By the summer of 1945, the War Department issued sweeping logistical directives to clear the domestic prison camps. The objective was absolute: the immediate mass repatriation of all Axis prisoners back to Europe. This triggered the supreme historical paradox of their captivity. The exact same women who had stepped onto American soil 2 years earlier, trembling in anticipation of execution, now desperately fought to remain inside their foreign cages. They mobilized their internal hierarchies not for ideological defiance, but for sheer survival. Across the female enclosures, the captives drafted formal collective petitions. They stood before American camp commanders begging for asylum, civilian work contracts, or indefinite detention, anything to prevent their deportation. Their panic was grounded in a terrifying reality. Post-Hour Zero Germany was no longer a functioning nation. It was a pulverized, starving landscape partitioned by the victorious powers. For the women whose hometowns had been swallowed by the Soviet occupation zone, returning meant walking directly into the abyss. They knew that their official status as Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the very uniforms that had caused the Americans so much initial administrative confusion, would instantly mark them for severe reprisal. The safety of the American barbed wire was infinitely preferable to the anarchic ruin of their homeland. But they were pleading with an unfeeling machine. American commanders and legal officers were not operating on empathy. They were strictly bound by the rigid text of international law. Article 75 of the 1929 Geneva Convention was explicit. Prisoners of war had to be returned to their country of origin as quickly as possible following the conclusion of hostilities. The pipeline had to be cleared. The bureaucracy processed their desperation as standard administrative friction. Every petition was reviewed, formally stamped with red ink, and flatly denied. The machinery of demobilization could not be paused for human terror. With their paperwork finalized, the protective illusion of their captivity evaporated. Executed with the exact same cold, mechanical efficiency that had governed their intake, American military police formed the women into columns, marched them out of the wooden compounds, and escorted them back toward the dusty rail sidings where their journey had begun. The heavy steel doors of the rail cars slid shut, echoing across the same dusty sidings where the women had arrived 2 years earlier. But the meaning of those locked doors had entirely inverted. In 1943, American military police secured the boxcars to shield the domestic home front from dangerous enemy combatants. Now, in the late summer of 1945, the guards locked the doors to forcibly eject reluctant captives from their secure sanctuary, shipping them back across the Atlantic into the smoking, starved ruins of a shattered continent. This obscure logistical anomaly reveals a profound, unsettling truth about the nature of mechanized total war. The 1929 Geneva Convention functioned precisely as its creators intended. It successfully guaranteed humane treatment, provided unprecedented material comfort, and organized an orderly mass repatriation at the cessation of hostilities. Yet, it was this exact, unyielding compliance with international law that ultimately forced these women back into a landscape of famine and foreign occupation they were desperately fighting to avoid. The American military machine was never designed to process human nuance, ideological shifts, or individual survival instincts. It operated solely on scale, logistics, and rigid adherence to the rulebook. In the end, it was not the fanatical indoctrination of Nazi propaganda that defined their fate, nor their own frantic collective pleas for asylum. Their destiny was sealed by the very thing that had saved them, an indifferent, colossal bureaucracy that simply processed the paperwork, cleared the camps, and relentlessly reversed the pipeline. This inescapable paradox brings us to the final, sobering truth of their journey through the American military machine. These women survived the deadliest conflict in human history for one simple reason. Their captors strictly and relentlessly obeyed the international rules of war. Yet, as the transport ships carried them eastward across the Atlantic, the ultimate irony of their captivity was finalized. The exact same legal framework that had guaranteed their safety, fed them in abundance, and shielded them from the slaughter of the battlefield was now the very mechanism forcing them back into the ashes of a homeland that simply no longer existed.